Hello, everyone. It's Mrs. Tredo. I'm here to read the passages from the midterm. If you're a person who likes to listen to something rather than read it yourself, or if you like to listen and follow along while you read, I thought this little video might be useful for you. Enjoy and good luck on your midterm. I know you're going to do a great job. So we're going to start with our first resource. Our source that is about Spokane's 1918 fight against the Spanish influenza. So you guys will know Spokane is from Washington. So it begins. War brings flu home. The 1918-1919 influenza pandemic infected 500 million people worldwide and killed between 50 and 100 million people, upwards of 5% of the human population. It didn't spare the U.S., where more than 500,000 people died. Joseph Waring, a medical historian in South Carolina, called it, quote, the greatest medical holocaust in history. And Isaac Starr, in the Annals of Internal Medicine, ranked it as one of the three most destructive human epidemics, along with the Justinian plague in the year 541 and the Black Death in the mid-1300s. At the same time, the world was seeing the end of what would later be called World War I, referred to at the time as the Great War. The so-called war to end all wars would result in the deaths of 9 million combatants and 7 million civilians, making it the third deadliest war ever, behind World War II and the Mongol conquest of the 13th century. It is no coincidence the war and influenza pandemic struck at the same time. Though the war began in Europe in 1914, the U.S. didn't join the Allies until 1917. The draft was extended, and the Army went from having tens of thousands of troops to millions. While theories compete about the flu's source, there is no argument that it was ravaging the soldiers in Europe in 1917, where the newly expanded American Army was headed. During their tours, men from around the world, including Americans, lived in tight, squalid conditions that, quote, favored the transmission of influenza. Men moved between camps frequently and went overseas and back, facilitating the transmission of the disease over even wider areas, wrote Kirsten Snover in her 2008 master's degree thesis for Eastern Washington University, called, quote, the Spanish influenza epidemic of 1918-1919, the Spokane experience. Because of the war, what might have been a limited epidemic quickly became a pandemic, with troops spreading infection all over the globe. So that's source one. Source two, I'm not going to read because it is a YouTube video. You guys can listen to that on YouTube. The next source is from history.com. When the Spanish flu first appeared in early March 1918, it had all the hallmarks of a seasonal flu, albeit a highly contagious and virulent strain. One of the first registered cases was Albert Gitchell, a U.S. Army cook at Camp Funston in Kansas, who was hospitalized with a 104-degree fever. The virus spread quickly through the Army installation, home to 54,000 troops. By the end of the month, 1,100 troops had been hospitalized and 38 had died after developing pneumonia. As U.S. troops deployed en masse for the war effort in Europe, they carried the Spanish flu with them. Throughout April and May of 1918, the virus spread like wildfire through England, France, Spain, and Italy. An estimated 3/4 of the French military was infected in the spring of 1918, and as many as half of the British troops. Yet, the first wave of the virus did not appear to be particularly deadly, with symptoms like high fever and malaise, usually lasting only 3 days. According to limited public health data from the time, mortality rates seemed similar to the flu. Interestingly, it was during this time that the Spanish flu earned its misnomer. Spain was neutral during World War I, and unlike its European neighbors, it didn't impose wartime censorship on its press. In France, England, and the United States, newspapers weren't allowed to report on anything that could harm the war effort, including news that a crippling virus was sweeping through the troops. Since Spanish journalists were some of the only ones reporting on widespread flu outbreak in the spring of 1918, the pandemic became known as the, quote, Spanish flu. Reported cases of Spanish flu dropped off over the summer of 1918, and there was hope at the beginning of August that the virus had run its course. In retrospect, it was only the calm before the storm. Somewhere in Europe, a mutated strain of the Spanish flu virus had emerged that had the power to kill a perfectly healthy young man or woman within 24 hours of showing the first signs of infection. In late August 1918, military ships departed the English port city of Plymouth, carrying troops unknowingly infected with this new, far deadlier strain of Spanish flu. As these ships arrived in cities like Brest in France, Boston in the United States, and Freetown in West Africa, the second wave of the global pandemic began. The rapid movement of soldiers around the globe was a major spreader of the disease, says James Harris, a historian at Ohio State University who studies both infectious disease and World War I. The entire military-industrial complex of moving lots of men and material in crowded conditions was certainly a huge contributing factor in the ways the pandemic spread. Harris believes that the rapid spread of the Spanish flu in the fall of 1918 was at least partially to blame on public health officials unwilling to impose quarantines during wartime. In Britain, for example, a government official named Arthur Newsholme knew full well that a strict civilian lockdown was the best way to fight the spread of the highly contagious disease. But he wouldn't risk crippling the war effort by keeping munitions factory workers and other civilians home. According to Harris's research, Newsholme concluded that the relentless needs of the warfare justified incurring the risk of spreading infection and encouraged Britons to simply carry on during the pandemic. The public health response to the crisis in the United States was further hampered by a severe nursing shortage, as thousands of nurses had been deployed to military camps in the front lines. The shortage was worsened by the American Red Cross's refusal to use trained African American nurses until the worst of the pandemic had already passed. So those are your sources, and I read them to you. So the next part, watch for me in the next video. Thanks, guys.